Some men don't speak because they have nothing to say. Others are silent because they've seen too much to waste words. What would you do if that silence was mistaken for weakness? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to show your support for every quiet hero who walks among us. Jonas Dwyer didn't walk like a man who needed help. He walked like a man who didn't care what others thought of his limp. Each morning, same as always, he made his way down Main Street at 6:13 a.m., a minute early out of respect, not habit. His jacket was the same one he'd worn since 1974, faded green with 2 sewn-on patches still holding strong, one from the 1st Marine Division and one from his final deployment in Okinawa. The third patch, the one from Chosin, had frayed down to the point where only the thread remembered what it once represented. He never replaced it. He'd said once that some things should be allowed to fade, others should never be touched. But Jonas had become invisible in a town that hadn't earned the right to forget him. Teenagers passed him without a glance. Some whispered when he walked by. Others rolled their eyes at the cap on his head. U.S. Marine veteran. He never flinched. That morning was no different, until Zane Tucker spotted him across the street. Zane leaned against the brick wall of Clyde's Corner Mart with a Red Bull in hand and a smirk crawling across his face. The bottle-cap-shaped scar above his left eyebrow scrunched as he squinted. He didn't know why the old man annoyed him. Maybe it was the way Jonas didn't seem afraid. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was just easier to hate what you didn't understand. "There he is," Zane muttered to his crew. Mason Green and Diego Hart looked up from their phones. Corey Flynn, always trailing behind in spirit and spine, adjusted his hoodie like it might shield him from what was coming. "What, the jacket guy again?" Diego asked. Zane chuckled. "Yeah, fossil with hero patches." Mason was the only one who hesitated. "Dude, he's just going to the bakery. Leave him alone." Zane didn't even answer. He stepped off the curb and crossed the street. Jonas was about 20 feet away now, arms full with a small brown bag from Gloria's bakery. He always picked up his rolls first, coffee second. Gloria knew to have them waiting. Zane intercepted him halfway. "Morning, Sarge," he said, mockingly sharp, blocking the sidewalk. Jonas didn't break stride until he had to. He shifted slightly to the left, attempting to go around. Zane mirrored him. "You dropped something," Zane added, reaching down toward Jonas's coat. Jonas stopped. Not fast, not nervous. He just stopped and looked at Zane. The air changed. Zane's fingers pinched the bottom corner of the frayed patch. He tugged once. Jonas didn't move. Then, with a swift jerk, Zane ripped the fabric loose. Mason and Diego winced. The sound was small, but sharp, like tearing history apart with bare hands. Jonas's eyes didn't flash. His lips didn't curl. He just looked down at the shredded patch in Zane's hand. Then met the boy's gaze with such stillness it made Corey take a step back. "You know what that was?" Jonas asked, voice dry as old bark. "Nope," Zane said, flipping it in his fingers. "A mistake." Jonas turned and walked past them, slower now, not from pain, but from gravity. Zane looked down at the patch, and for a moment something uneasy passed over his face. By the time Jonas reached the bakery steps, Gloria was already rushing out. Was that Zane Tucker again?" she asked, her voice rising with every word. "What did they do now?" Jonas handed her the bag without a word and opened his phone. He hadn't called this number in 3 years. "Sergeant Vance," the voice answered on the second ring. "It's Dwyer." There was a pause. "Yes, sir. I need you to gather the men." Another pause, then, "Yes, sir." Back across the street, Zane tried to laugh, but it didn't land the same. Corey leaned in. "You really just ripped that thing off?" "It was nothing," Zane said, but he didn't sound sure. "Just a patch." Mason's brows pulled tight. "You ever seen the way he looks at that jacket?" That thing's older than all of us combined." Zane scoffed, tossing the fabric in a nearby trash can. "Guy should have retired it like 20 years ago." None of them said anything after that. Not when they saw Jonas step into the diner and sit at his usual spot in the back corner, near the window where he could watch the alley. Not when they watched a pair of Marines in dress uniforms approach from down the block a few minutes later. Not even when Sergeant Adam Vance emerged from a black SUV, walked into the diner, and stepped back out with Jonas by his side. Jonas didn't say a word. But his silence was about to teach the loudest lesson these boys would ever learn. It took Jonas nearly 6 minutes to get up from the curb. Not because his bones ached, though they did, deep and relentlessly, but because he refused to let those boys' cruelty be the final word in the moment. He sat in the middle of the street as traffic paused, not daring to honk, as Gloria rushed out from the bakery, her apron fluttering, a bag of still-warm croissants abandoned behind the counter. "Jonas, my God, are you all right?" He waved her off gently, placing his hand on her shoulder when she tried to help him to his feet. "I'm not hurt, just tired. Let me breathe a minute." She looked shaken. Her gaze kept darting toward the alley where the teens had disappeared. The young one with the tattoo, Diego, had actually laughed after shoving Jonas off the curb. Zane Tucker, the ringleader, had only looked down at Jonas for a heartbeat longer than the others before slapping Mason on the back and walking off. "He's a Marine," Gloria whispered under her breath, as if the boys could still hear her. "You don't push a Marine." Jonas finally stood. His right knee groaned in protest, but his face gave away nothing. He had mastered that in Korea, then again in Okinawa, then again every single day since he'd come home to a world that didn't always know how to look him in the eye. "You want me to call the police?" Gloria asked. "No," Jonas replied. "Not yet." He took his bag of rolls from her hand and resumed his walk toward the bench by the town square. He had sat there every morning since Ruth died. 17 years of sunrises and memory, always alone and never once interrupted until today. The boys had followed him from the crosswalk, whispering behind him, laughing, mimicking his gait. Mason had done a mock limp. Corey had tossed a gum wrapper near his shoes. And then came the shove. He sat down on the bench with a sigh, setting his paper bag down beside him. For a long time he stared forward. The wind barely rustled the leaves. His back straightened as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. It was an old one, a flip model with a faded Marine Corps decal stuck to the back. He pressed one number. Speed dial. It rang twice. Sergeant Vance speaking. Jonas's voice was gravel and steel. "Adam, I need a favor." There was a pause. "Then, sir?" "There are some boys in this town who just made a mistake." "What happened?" "I'll tell you when I see you. Bring the others." The line was silent for a beat. Then Sergeant Adam Vance, currently assigned to the local Marine recruiting office, simply said, "Understood." When Jonas ended the call, his hand remained on the phone for a while, thumb tracing the worn plastic. He remembered something Ruth used to say when he'd come home looking like he carried the whole world on his shoulders. They never understand quiet men until they see the storm they've been holding back. Jonas tucked the phone away. Back in the alley, Zane Tucker spat on the ground and kicked over a trash can. "Did you see his face?" he barked, laughing. "Old man looked like he was going to cry." Mason chuckled, but not as loud. "I don't know, man," Mason muttered. "Maybe we took it too far. He was just walking." Zane scoffed, turning on him. "What, you soft now? He's just a crusty old relic who thinks that uniform still means something. Man's a fossil." Diego leaned against the wall, pretending to text, but his eyes were on Zane. "You heard what Gloria said. He's a Marine." Zane shrugged. "So? What's he going to do? March back here with his walker?" They all laughed, though Mason's was the weakest. The thing was, Zane didn't really care about Jonas. Zane didn't care about much. Since his dad got laid off and took to drinking instead of fixing the car like he promised, Zane had been walking around like he had to punch the world before it punched him first. Jonas just happened to be in the way. But as they laughed, a shadow fell over the entrance to the alley. A man in fatigue stepped into view, arms crossed. Behind him, 3 others followed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Zane's mouth dropped slightly. "Who the hell?" "Hey, kids," Sergeant Adam Vance said, stepping forward. He didn't shout. He didn't posture, but the way he walked, the squared shoulders, the unreadable expression, made even Zane take a step back. "You know who I am?" "Marine recruiter guy," Diego said, voice suddenly thin. "Right." Vance took another step. "And do you know Jonas Dwyer?" None of them spoke. "You should," Vance said. "He taught half the men I served with how to survive. He led a platoon in the Chosin Reservoir. He trained my uncle, my father, me." Zane scoffed. "We didn't do anything. That's not what the street cameras say." Now Mason looked panicked. "Wait, camera?" Vance didn't answer. He only motioned behind him. A second group of Marines rounded the corner. They weren't in dress blues, they weren't even armed, but they were calm, silent, and present in a way that made the boys realize this wasn't a bluff. Zane looked to the others, but no one stepped up beside him. For the first time, he realized he might be the only one still pretending it was all a joke. "Where is he?" Mason asked quietly. Vance nodded toward the square. "Sitting on a bench. Same place he's been every day for 17 years. Zane opened his mouth, but the words never came. Because just then, a mother walked past the alley with her toddler in tow. She smiled at one of the Marines. The Marines smiled back. Respect without effort. And Zane, for a flicker of a second, saw what it looked like when people earned their place in the world. And what it meant to throw that respect away with nothing but a shove. The recruiting office door opened slowly, and Jonas stepped in like a man returning to a place time had tried to forget. The room was brightly lit, with posters of proud Marines in dress blues lining the walls, and a folded American flag under glass above the reception desk. Sergeant Adam Vance was waiting, already standing at attention, not out of formality, but reverence. The moment their eyes met, Adam dropped the posture and walked straight toward him. "You sure about this?" Adam asked. Jonas nodded. "The world doesn't teach respect by accident anymore." Adam let out a breath and motioned him to the back office, where 3 Marines sat in quiet conversation. Lance Corporal Nguyen, Staff Sergeant Ramirez, and Gunnery Sergeant Bell. Younger than Jonas by a generation, maybe 2, but forged in the same kind of fire. Each man stood as Jonas entered. "Gents," Jonas greeted with a firm nod, "I appreciate you being here." Ramirez spoke first. "Sir, it's an honor. We've read about you. The kind of stories they don't put in the news." Jonas only gave a faint smile. "Stories don't matter unless they change something." Nguyen glanced toward Adam. "You want us to scare 'em?" "No," Jonas said. "I want you to teach them. What they do after that, up to them." Bell leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You really think they'll listen?" "I think someone once said the same about me in 51. The room quieted at that. They respected the man in front of them, but it wasn't just his rank or history. It was the way he carried silence like a weapon. When Jonas Dwyer spoke, even air stopped to listen. Back in the alley, Zane walked in loops, tossing a half-empty energy drink can against a wall just to hear the pop. The others had bailed on him. Corey had gone quiet since yesterday. Diego ghosted the group chat. Mason kept sending messages like, "We should apologize," and "This feels bigger than it was." But Zane couldn't. Not because he didn't want to. Because he didn't know how. He had spent the last few years learning that silence from men like his father meant either disinterest or fury. So when Jonas had stood there, saying nothing, Zane had mistaken it for weakness. Now, something about that man's stillness lingered like a bad echo. The sound of boots on pavement pulled him from his spiral. He turned and saw the Marines again. Not just Adam this time, all of them. Behind them, at a distance, was Jonas. He wasn't walking with them. He didn't need to. The alley belonged to him now. Zane's chest tightened. He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to back him up, but the alley was empty. Adam stepped forward. Invigorated, Zane didn't reply. "You remember Jonas Dwyer?" Adam asked. Zane stared. "Penmen," Adam continued, "led recon teams through valleys so silent they could hear their heartbeats in their boots. Men followed him because they knew he'd get them home. They'd crawl through mud for him. Because he never raised his voice, he didn't need to." Still, Zane said nothing. His jaw worked, but his lips didn't part. "You shoved him," Adam said, his voice softening. "Mocked him, and now you're going to listen." Nguyen stepped forward, not threateningly, but with purpose. In his hand he held a folded piece of paper. "Ever read about the Chosin Reservoir?" Nguyen asked. Zane blinked. "What?" "Doesn't matter," Nguyen replied, unfolding the paper and reading. "In temperatures 40 below zero, with weapons frozen and frostbite setting in, Jonas Dwyer pulled 2 wounded Marines out of a collapsed ravine. When enemy fire pinned him down, he played dead for 6 hours to keep them covered. When they were extracted, both were alive. He wasn't even scratched." Nguyen looked up. "That's what you pushed into the street?" Zane swallowed. "Tell him what you said," Adam ordered. Not cruelly, just flat, like a man asking for facts. Zane stared at the ground. I said he looked pathetic." "You said he was a fossil," Adam reminded him. "Did he look pathetic when he sat in that street and waited for the humiliation to settle? When he let you walk away?" Zane started, then shut his mouth. The Marine stepped aside. Jonas walked forward. He didn't look at Zane like an enemy. He looked at him the way he used to look at new recruits on their first day, confused, cocky, and completely unprepared. Jonas stopped a few feet away. "You want to know what was going through my head when you shoved me?" he asked. Zane lifted his eyes slowly. "I thought of my friend Marcus, who took a grenade to save 3 boys who didn't even speak English. I thought of Ruth, my wife, who spent 50 years reminding me that not all battles need rifles. I thought about whether you were worth correcting, whether silence would be more useful than anger." Zane's lips trembled, but he didn't speak. Jonas took one more step. "But then I remembered. Someone once told me the only thing worse than ignorance is letting it win." He handed Zane a small weathered book. It was titled Letters from the Forgotten War. Jonas turned to go. But before he could, Zane's voice cracked out of him like a whisper under pressure. "Sorry." Jonas paused. Zane added, "I didn't know." Jonas didn't look back. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You didn't care to." And then he walked away. But the Marines didn't follow him this time. They stayed, and they looked at Zane. Not with hate, but with the same look they gave recruits after their first failure. Hopeful, because failure was how learning began. And maybe this boy, this angry, loud, bitter boy, was finally quiet enough to hear it. The next morning, Jonas arrived at the bakery precisely at 6:15 a.m., as he had for years. He moved slower than he used to, but not because he was weak. It was the kind of slowness that came from confidence. A man unbothered by time, a man who had earned every step. Gloria was already unlocking the front door, fumbling with the key ring as she noticed him approach. "Morning, Jonas," she said, opening the door wide. "Morning, Gloria." She gave him a long look, eyes darting briefly to the alley down the block. "You heard what happened after you left yesterday?" He shook his head. "They stayed with that boy a long time, that Zane. They didn't yell, didn't shame him. They just stood there with him until he looked like he didn't know how to stand on his own." Jonas nodded once. He hadn't needed to ask. He already knew. He took his seat at the corner table by the window. the one with the view of the bench in the square and the faint outline of the alley beyond. His coffee arrived, black, no sugar, just the way Ruth used to make it, and he let the warmth settle in his hands. The newspaper lay unopened beside him. At exactly 6:28, the bakery's door creaked open again. Zane stepped inside, alone. He wasn't wearing his usual hoodie or beat-up sneakers. He wore a plain collared shirt tucked in. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, not in defiance, but to keep them from shaking. Gloria blinked. "Can I help you?" Zane nodded. I was wondering if I could speak to Mr. Dwyer." Jonas didn't turn around. He simply raised a hand and pointed to the seat across from him. Zane hesitated before walking over. He sat down, folding his hands tightly in front of him, his eyes on the coffee mug like it might explain what to say. "I didn't know about the chosen reservoir," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I read about it last night. I stayed up. I didn't know they called you the Frozen Guardian." Jonas didn't respond. "I didn't know a lot of things," Zane said. "That's the trouble with youth," Jonas said finally. "You think you're the first one to feel lost." Zane swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. For what I said. For what I did." Jonas looked at him not with pity but with clarity. "I don't want your apology," he said. Zane's face fell. "I want your change." A silence passed between them. Then Zane reached into his backpack and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I wrote something. Sergeant Vance said maybe I should read it at the school assembly today. He said it might help." Jonas took the paper, scanned the opening lines, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. He didn't say whether it was good. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, "You're not done yet. You've just taken your first step. Don't stop walking." Zane nodded, eyes glistening with something between gratitude and shame. Then, after a long pause, he did something he'd never done before in his life. He stood up, backed away from the table, and offered Jonas a salute. He wasn't perfect. His elbow was too wide, fingers slightly crooked. But Jonas didn't correct him. He nodded in return, eyes steady. Zane turned and left. That afternoon the school gymnasium filled slowly, teachers, parents, students, in wrinkled uniforms and scattered chatter. It was the annual Community Appreciation Assembly where the town honored teachers, first responders, and veterans. But this year one name had been added to the program last minute. Jonas Dwyer. He didn't want the attention. He hadn't agreed to speak, but when he arrived, escorted by Sergeant Vance and Ramirez, the applause was immediate, and it didn't stop for a full minute. He took his seat in the front row, hands folded on his cane. Then, unexpectedly, the principal stepped up to the podium. "We had a young man request to speak today," she said. "His request came with an apology, but also with a commitment to do better. Mr. Zane Tucker has something to share." Zane stepped onto the stage in a simple black button-up, the folded sheet of paper in his hands now slightly crumpled from hours of nervous grip. He looked out at the crowd, then at Jonas, and then he read, "I used to think strength was about who speaks the loudest, who pushes the hardest, but I was wrong. Strength is silent. It shows up every day. It forgives. It teaches. It walks into the same bakery every morning without asking for anything but respect." A hush fell over the room. He didn't respect Jonas Dwyer. Not because he wasn't worthy, but because I didn't know how. But yesterday, I saw something in his silence that shouted louder than anything I've ever said. And I want to learn, not just about history, but about humility and honor. By the end of the speech, no one clapped. Not at first. They were still processing what it meant to see a boy humbled, to see the gap between generations bridged, not by punishment, but by truth. Then the applause came, slow, then rolling. Jonas stood, and in that moment Zane stepped down from the stage and did something no one expected. He walked to Jonas and offered the folded paper. Jonas took it, shook his hand, and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "That's how you march for'ard." Later that week, the town installed a plaque on the square bench where Jonas sat each morning. It read, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Jonas Dwyer, Marine, mentor, and quiet guardian." No fanfare, no speeches, but every morning after that, people nodded when they passed him. Sometimes they brought their kids, and Jonas, for the first time in years, wasn't alone on that bench. Though the world hadn't changed overnight, but one alley did. And for a quiet old Marine, that was more than enough.